Hi class, this is the first of three videos that will be covering Chapter 4 material. Chapter 4 discusses the two levels of analyses, macrosociology and microsociology. Macrosociology will be discussed in the form of social structure and its primary components, and microsociology will be discussed primarily through looking at social interaction, what symbolic interactionists study, and two major theories that go along with this level, ethnomethodology and dramaturgy. This first video is the longest of the three. I will introduce both levels and then we'll do a deep dive into social structure. You will see on these slides built-in kind of activity discussion questions called Think About It. I do feel like it is very helpful if you have a notebook or some scratch paper to, in fact, think about it when I am asking you to consider your place in the social structure. This will make this terminology much more relevant to you and hopefully easier to remember when it's time to take the test on this material. So let's begin by just acknowledging that there are two levels of sociological analysis. There is macrosociology, which looks at the broad features of society, kind of studies society as a whole, centers society itself as an actor, and microsociology, which is social interactions, how people interact with one another, how people think about one another, what they notice about one another, and how this impacts how they treat each other. So these kind of smaller elements of society. And you've seen these terms before. We talked about macrosociology and microsociology when we talked about the theoretical perspectives, that structural functionalism and conflict theories are examples of macrosociological theories, and symbolic interactionism is a microsociological perspective. But now we're just going to go a little bit deeper into both of these levels. Like, what does it mean to actually study something on that particular level? And just to note that in order to have a full view of social life, we must use both. So if you're a sociologist who primarily studies macrosociology, that does not mean that your work is any more necessary or important than someone that studies microsociology. That most social phenomena exist on both a macro and a micro level. And to fully understand it, we need to look at both levels. And your book offers the example of homelessness to kind of illustrate what it means to look at something from both levels. So you see here a homeless person sleep on a snowy bench. And if you were a person who used macrosociology, you might would focus on the broad aspects of society, like what is it about our economy that has contributed to a rise of homelessness, how maybe have changes in family or societal cohesion contributed to this, or even like the role of social stratification or social classes. If you were a sociologist who used a microsociological approach, you might would be more interested in how does the homeless interact with one another, what type of bonds and relationships do they form, how do they interact with non-homeless populations. So you might want to study, panhandling requests and how the homeless make those. You might would study how they think about themselves, how they perceive their place in society. All of that would be an example of microsociology. And it's just worth noting that almost any topic can be approached from a macrosociological or microsociological lens, regardless of whatever topic that is. So, for the rest of this particular presentation, we're going to be focusing specifically on macrosociology, and that is social structure, right? So, our society has a framework, and the that framework is significant because it helps guide our behavior. It lets us know like what options are available to us, what do people expect of us. It allows us to predict how other people are going to behave in general or particularly towards us. And the example you see here is a football field with the positions identified. And how is this like social structure? Well, the idea is that if you know that you are a free safety, what is expected of you, what you can do in that position is very different than maybe if you were a left tackle or to switch to the offense side if you were the quarterback. So knowing more or less if you were playing that game, being confident that the center isn't going to take the ball and like kick it directly in your face, if you are a on the defensive side, allows you to somewhat predict what the play is going to be, or at least allows you to predict what the play is definitely not going to be. And this is how social structure works, is there are components that kind of explain or establish who we are in society. What is expected of us, but based on that status of who we are, and then allows us to kind of form relationships, alliances with other people because we know that they share a similar status or occupy a similar social role. And so when I use those terms, statuses and social role, it brings me to, what are the elements of social structure? And so if social structure is the way in which society is organized into predictable relationships, we are specifically going to be talking about four elements of that, and that is social statuses, social roles, groups, and social institutions. Now, please note that your book includes culture as an element of social structure, but given we have had a chapter on culture already, I won't be going back over that material, and furthermore, I won't be testing you again on that material. And similarly, although social class is an element of societies, and whether or not you see it as a separate form of social structure or as a specific type of social status, doesn't matter. We are going to be saving that for upcoming weeks in class, in which case we will be focusing. We'll be focusing on stratification and social class for in about, I think, 2 weeks. So you're welcome to go ahead and read that material, but once again, you are not expected to know that for the upcoming test on this chapter. So we are going to focus on social statuses, social roles, groups, and social institutions. Beginning with social statuses, and these are the full range of socially defined positions within a large group of society. And sometimes they are within a hierarchy so that there is a lowest and highest position. And people can and most often do hold multiple statuses at a time. So, for instance, I might have the status of being a woman and being African American and being heterosexual and being a lecturer and being a runner and being a dog owner, right? All of these are statuses that I currently hold, in addition to being someone's daughter and people's friend. And I have two younger brothers, so I'm a sister. So you similarly have multiple statuses. So for your own notes, if you just want to think about some of the statuses that you currently hold and maybe write down three of them. And now we're going to further classify those statuses. So, one way to distinguish between statuses is whether they're ascribed or achieved. An ascribed status is assigned to a person by society, usually at birth, and it doesn't really matter like who you are, whether or not, you have some unique talents or characteristics. Like this is just a status that society defines you as, that you usually don't have a lot of input. And so if you think about some ascribed statuses you may have, things that might come to mind would be things like, your sex at birth, your race and ethnicity. Age is an ascribed status, right? No matter how hard you might work at it, you can't be older than what you are. And, although I would like to believe I can age backwards, I really can't. So your age is largely determined at birth. And then there are ones that can be ascribed or achieved. And that would be like your social class because you're born into a family that has a specific social class, but later you might have a different social class through your own efforts. And in some cases, in some societies, in some homes, religion operates similarly. And even something like being someone's sister or daughter are ascribed statuses, right? The moment I was born and took my first, successful breaths, those statuses existed for me. But not all statuses are assigned to us by society. Some of them we have to earn. They reflect choices that we make. And so we call these achieved statuses. And so while daughter is an ascribed status, being someone's mother, being a parent is an achieved status, right? It reflects a choice that you made. Being someone's friend is an achieved status. Being college educated is an achieved status. Your occupation is an achieved status. And so, if you did write down three statuses, take a look at what you wrote down and, mark whether or not those statuses would be considered ascribed or achieved. It's worth noting that most statuses are achieved statuses unless you're talking about things like sex and race and ethnicity and age. Otherwise, a lot of the other statuses that most people think of are, daughter, son, but otherwise, a lot of statuses are achieved. So if all three of your statuses fall in one category, maybe just for your own notes, so that you can have something to refer back to later, write down two of the other type. So if I wrote down that I was a lecturer, a friend, and a runner, all three of those are achieved statuses. So maybe I would like to add to my list that I am female, because that's an ascribed status. The final kind of concept related to status I want to introduce before moving on to the next element of social structure is master status. And this is a status that dominates all other statuses you hold at that time and thereby usually determines your general position within society. Master statuses can be achieved or ascribed. I think the best way to kind of know what if something is a master status is that it's not very common, in most cases, and it is usually something that society either really idolizes, like you're a celebrity, or something that carries a certain amount of stigma, like you are a felon. Stephen Hawking, who is the example your book gives, is an interesting example because he is a paraplegic, and that is a master status. Just because of how we see disability in our society. But then he also is like a genius and has like won the Nobel Prize. And so being like that level of genius is a master status as well. And so he is a rare example of someone that already had a master status, but then later one that, and then later, achieved yet a second master status that in a lot of cases supersedes his original master status. Now, you might be sitting here looking at your statuses and thinking, like, I don't think I have a master status. And that's totally okay. I don't have a master status. There's nothing that really sets me that apart. Because keep in mind, master statuses are not guaranteed. There may not be a status that dominates all of our other statuses. We might not be an Olympic gold medalist. We may not be a, you know, HIV positive. In most parts of the South, being a part of the LGBT community is probably going to be considered a master status. As someone that spent my last 6 years in California, I sometimes this is very context specific because I would not necessarily say being gay or being a lesbian would necessarily be a master status in other parts of the country. But the main point here is if you don't have a master status, don't feel bad and don't feel as if you've got to have one because a lot of people in society don't. We just have a whole bunch of statuses that we hold at one time without there being a master. Now, for all of our statuses, there are social roles, and these are the obligations or expectations that apply to our behavior when we occupy a particular social status in a particular situation. And social roles are important because it allows us to formulate our behavior before we do it, so mentally, so that we can fit our actions to that of others. So we can act the way others are expecting of us. And if this sounds a lot like norms, you are right. Social roles are related to norms, expected standards of behavior. So all of your statuses do come with social roles, how people expect you to act, and in some cases, maybe even how you're obligated to act if you have a status such as parent or employee or student. So, for at least one of the statuses you wrote down, see if you can describe your social role in relation to that status. Like for me, if I am a pet owner, part of that requires me taking care of my pet, feeding my dog daily, making sure he's up to date on all of his shots and vaccines. I have to take him to get regularly groomed because of the type of dog he is. And being a good pet owner, I think also means that I'm, expected to love him and treat him kindly. And that is the kind of social role associated with being a dog owner. So think about what social roles you have associated with all of your statuses. Now, because you have multiple statuses, you can experiencing something called role conflict. And for some of your statuses, you might be experiencing something called role strain. So let's start with role conflict. Role conflict is the diagram that you see where there are multiple statuses, and the statuses are in the green boxes. And all of those statuses have some obligations and expectations. And you see those, and that's social roles. And so you see those in the kind of orange yellow boxes. And so it's the idea that, you're someone's son or daughter, you're a friend, you're a student, you're a worker. And on this particular day, this particular couple of days, as a good son or daughter, your mom is in the hospital, you should definitely go visit her. Your friend is turning 21 and, you should probably be there to help them celebrate at their 21st birthday party. As a student, if you have an exam tomorrow, you probably need to prepare and study if you want to do well. And then as a worker, your boss is really likes it when you're available for last minute emergency overtime. So In role conflict, the idea is that when you have all of these statuses that can have competing roles, it's really hard to do them all well, and you can feel overwhelmed, and you have to make decisions about which roles, which expectations do you live up to, and maybe which roles and expectations do you let slide. And this can vary person to person, and it's not always that you make the best decision, but the idea is that. That you have these multiple roles with these multiple statuses, and it's largely an impossibility to be doing each of them perfectly, day in and day out. Role strain is a little different. In this case, it's focused on one particular status, green box, and that one status might have competing roles in and of itself. So, in the case they give here, you're a student, and on one hand, you want to do well in your classes, but on the other hand, you do have a relationship with other students, and you maybe don't want to make them look bad. So, we consider this role strain because you kind of need to do both, but they're in competition with one another. And so, what does it mean to be a good student? Which one do you prioritize? The other example besides student that I like to give for role strain is being a parent. Because on one hand, you should want to have open communication with your child, especially if your child is older, a teenager or an adult. But on the other hand, you aren't just your child's friend. You do sometimes need to lay down the law and be an authoritarian and, exact discipline. So we would consider that role strain. How much of a friend should you be versus how much of a disciplinarian should you be in order to properly uphold your status of being a parent? And so the think about it here is just asking, have you ever experienced role strain? Are you currently experiencing role conflict? And if you're lucky enough that the answer to both those questions is no, maybe think about an example of someone in your life who experiences either of those concepts. The third element of social structure is groups. And so now we're moving outside of you and thinking about your relationship with other people. So a group is any number of people with similar norms, values, and expectations who interact with one another on a regular basis. And we used to think that this face to face interaction was necessary, but with advances in technology, we now want to think about really just kind of a more expanded definition of interaction, not necessarily face to face. It can be mediated interaction. So think about groups that you belong to. And really don't get too hung up on the word group. Like your group may not end with the word group, right? So, or club. Think about any type, any number of people with similar norms and values and expectations who you interact with on a regular basis. So, who all would that include? Similar to statuses, we can distinguish between groups. And one way we can distinguish is by defining them as either primary or secondary. Primary groups are smaller groups. They're characterized by intimate, usually face to face association. And cooperation. And they're very instrumental in the development of your roles and status in a person's day to day life. Primary groups would include your family, your close friends, your coworkers if don't work at a place that just has a massive number of employees, but if instead, you have a core set of coworkers. It might would include groups and organizations that you're part of, dependent on how intimate those groups are, right? So if you have a bowling league team and you're all super close and care about one another and really know one another, then it might would meet the classification of being a primary group. However, if you just have like a drop-in Monday night, soccer team, and you don't even really know everyone's name, who's there week to week, then that is less of a primary group and might be more of a secondary group, which is usually a formal group. It's more impersonal, and there's less social intimacy or mutual understanding. So if you have a group of friends at Gaston College, they may be your primary group, but your fellow students in a particular class, well, that might just be a secondary group. So, kind of like what we did with statuses, look at your group lists and determine whether your examples are primary or secondary. And once again, if you wrote down all examples of one and not the other, see if you can add examples of the other to your list. So if all your groups were secondary, then maybe consider, what some primary groups are in your life. Like I said, family, friends, other people that you are close to, that you regularly interact with. Now, in addition to primary and secondary, another way we distinguish between groups you belong to is in group and out group. In group is any group or category to which you feel like you belong. They are the we or the us. And out group is a category to which you don't belong. They are the they or the them. Now, these groups exist in relationship to one another. In order for there to be a in group, there must be an out group that you are comparing your group against, that you're setting your group apart from. And this is important because not all groups have necessarily an out group. If there isn't a us versus them mentality, like, so your family is a group, but it's not necessarily an in group, because I you probably aren't going around comparing your family to others, in a us versus them type of way. I don't know, unless you're like on some Montague Capulet type of family rivalry situation going on. Your school, like if you're an alum, there might be a in group out group if you have a really strong rival. So I went to UNC. UNC is my in group, and my out group are other colleges and campuses, particularly other ACC schools, especially of course Duke. And we even have a little slogan that's really popular on shirts, in Carolina versus all y'all, right? That versus all y'all is really cuts to the heart of what it means to have an in group. And it's that part of the significance of being in that group is based on the fact that other people aren't in that group. So just know that not all your groups might be an in group. So if you can't easily think of who the out group would be for your group, it's possible because there isn't one. And that's fine. That doesn't change the fact that it's, not still a group. And the final element, which I'm sure you're glad we're reaching because this video is getting a little long compared to our others, is social institutions. And you've seen this chart before when we talked about socialization, and that's because social institutions are the agents of socialization that we talked about previously. They're an organized way of meeting basic social needs. And you don't have a think about it for this one, because unlike statuses, social roles, and groups, which can vary person to person, social roles are pretty much consistent for everyone in society. They might vary society to society, and what they look like definitely varies society to society. But this is not one of the ones that you as an individual get to establish. This part of the social structure is not unique to you as the individual. And so a lot of these social institutions, family, religion, education, economy, medicine, politics, law, science, military, mass media, we talked about when we talked about socialization and agents of socialization. But just know that they are also considered part of the social structure. And that's it for this video. Video 2 is super short, so it kind of makes up for this one being super long. Thanks for sticking with me.